So, welcome everybody, whether you're hearing this live on Zoom today, the 7th of March, or whether you're catching up on YouTube. You have joined the History of Christian Missions, part 19, and this is the life and legacy of William Carey, part 2. Well, the story so far, if you missed last week's, you can easily catch up on YouTube, but just briefly, William Carey was born in a poor English family in 1761 and was apprenticed to a shoemaker. And that was where he became a Christian, partly through the witness of one of the customers. As he read his Bible, he realized that the Great Commission was for all believers for all time. And after later becoming a Baptist minister, he spoke at a local pastor's meeting, challenging them to seriously consider the needs of those overseas who've not yet heard the gospel. Having received a largely negative response, he wrote a booklet entitled An Inquiry into the Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathen. It's quite a long title, but it's known in short as The Inquiry. It had 5 sections, and it's generally recognized that this changed the Protestant Reformation from being only an inward-looking message to an outward-looking movement that would take the gospel to the ends of the earth. And history has shown that this inquiry by William Carey was the Magna Carta of the modern missions movement. So let's continue. The following year, William Carey spoke to the Nottingham Baptist Ministers Association. That was a larger group. And he spoke on Isaiah 54, verses 2 and 3, part of which says, "Enlarge the place of your tent, stretch your curtains wide, do not hold back, lengthen your cords, strengthen your stakes, for you will spread out to the right and to the left." Now, during his sermon, he uttered what has now become a legendary quotation in the history of Christian missions. What he said was, "Expect great things, attempt great things." And today that quotation has come to us as, "Expect great things from God, attempt great things for God." By the way, notice the order of those two things. Sometimes it's put the other way around, but first we have to expect great things from God through prayer, and then go and attempt great things for God. Well, it was a riveting sermon, but as one biographer wrote, Carey was an embarrassment. He had a bee in his bonnet about missions. In other words, that's an English phrase, but it means he had what seemed to be almost an obsession. He seemed fixated on the idea of reaching the unreached with the gospel. That's not so revolutionary today, but it certainly was back then. And when he finished the meeting, after he'd finished speaking, the people were starting to leave. William Carey gripped the arm of Andrew Fuller. Do you remember Andrew Fuller? He was the one who'd convinced William from the Bible of the need for believers' baptism. William gripped his arm and said, "Is nothing again going to be done?" Well, next day, a small group decided that they would go ahead and organize a mission board. And that marks the start 230 years ago of what later became known as the BMS, the Baptist Missionary Society, and what today is called BMS World Mission, which reaches out throughout the world. Within 5 months, 12 had joined the society, including Andrew Fuller, and it was his snuff box which was embossed with a picture of St. Paul's conversion, his snuff box became the place where the first pledges and the first donations were kept. Now, financially, it was not at all easy, as all of them were poor, with only small incomes. But Andrew Fuller became the first Home Secretary of the Society. However, it wasn't about just collecting money and having committees. They were eager to send someone. And before long, Dr. John Thomas, who was a medical doctor who'd served with the Royal Navy, volunteered to go as both a missionary and a doctor to Bengal. And almost immediately after he volunteered, Carey offered himself as his companion. Well, wasn't that a little bit rash? I mean, certainly many of Carey's friends thought so. Why was that rash? Well, first of all, his church objected, as it would have been left without their beloved pastor. Secondly, his father thought he was quite mad. Thirdly, France was then at war with the UK, making any travel by sea across the English Channel very dangerous. And of course, they had totally inadequate funds. But above all, Dorothy, his wife, had never moved more than a few miles from her home throughout her life. She couldn't read and she couldn't write. And not only did they have 3 sons, but she was now expecting another child. So, Carey might be the father of modern missions, but she was definitely not the mother of modern missions, and so refused point blank to go. Now, I think we can only but have sympathy with her in her situation. But her refusal did not change William Carey's mind. He went and he booked tickets for himself and for Felix, his 8-year-old son. But with a great lack of finance, they then proceeded to engage in many months of deputation meetings. In other words, going to churches and meeting a group of Christians to raise some money, until they had sufficient, at least for the voyage. And so Carey and Thomas were then commissioned to go. Finally, Carey, his son Felix, Dr. John Thomas, and his wife and daughter boarded a ship called the Oxford and set sail on the River Thames. Now, the River Thames is a river that connects London with the English Channel on the south coast. But they didn't get very far, as the voyage came to a halt just a little further along the coast at the city of Portsmouth. And that was because Dr. John Thomas had some money problems and his creditors were waiting for his unpaid debts to be settled before he left. So understandably, while there were both frustrations and great disappointments, there was also a dramatic change of plans. While they were waiting, Dorothy delivered her child and grudgingly agreed to sail to India, with the proviso that Kitty, her younger sister, also went with them, which meant, of course, they had to raise more money for 2 more tickets. They now required in total £700, which is about, I suppose, $1,000 US, and back then was a huge amount of money, but that was what was required for 8 of them to sail. but the extra funds proved difficult to raise. However, finally, on June the 13th, 1793, they boarded a Danish vessel, the Kron Princess Maria, and they set sail. The voyage took 5 months from Portsmouth to India, with little of significance happening until the ship began to pass the southernmost point of Africa. There, while there was already a very strong current, it met with a cyclone, which raised the waves to a height almost beyond belief. And a little after midnight on the 26th of August, the sea rose like mountains and flung the ship violently around in different directions. Carey's description is very graphic. He wrote, "The ship mounted on the top of a sea which could not be less than 50 or 60 yards, which is about 50 or 60 meters in height, from which the ship descended head first as from the roof of a house. The plunge was dreadful. All on board declared they had never experienced anything like it and concluded that the ship was going to the bottom." Well, it didn't, and they managed to survive a truly terrifying experience. And finally arrived in Calcutta on the 11th of November, which was almost exactly to the day 5 months after their departure from England. There, they transferred to a small fishing boat and floated into Calcutta. When Carey and Thomas stepped on the banks of the Hooghly River, the first great attempt had begun. However, their beginnings proved to be disastrous. Firstly, the East India Company, which was a large, successful commercial enterprise, was in control and was very unhappy with the presence of English missionaries. Carey himself was made to feel very unwelcome. There were different reasons for this, but partly the East India Company was very protective of its position and very wary of any disruption to their profitable work. And they felt that religion, or trying to change people's religion, would be a very unhelpful distraction for the workers. In short, they wanted them out, which resulted in the Careys experiencing constant ongoing harassment around them. Secondly, perhaps more surprisingly, there was opposition from some in the British government back home. Here is an example from a speech made in the UK Parliament in the early 19th century. Quote, "The sending of missionaries into our eastern possessions is the maddest, most extravagant, most costly, most indefensible project which has ever been suggested by a moonstruck fanatic. Such a scheme is pernicious, imprudent, useless, harmful, dangerous, profitless, and fantastic. It strikes against all reason and sound policy, and it brings the peace and safety of our possessions into peril." No, I don't think I'm reading too much into that, but certainly reading between the lines, one senses that any negative impact on continuing commercial success was the real source of their concern. The second problem was that John Thomas, the doctor, had grossly underestimated the cost of living in Calcutta. And so they urgently needed to find somewhere that would both keep them out of the way of the East India Company, but also allow them a cheaper standard of living. Well, in the event, they were forced to move to the interior to escape deportation, to a place of marshy, malarial swamps outside Calcutta. They lived in a moneylender's dilapidated house, which was rent-free, but in a very dangerous area that was the haunt of gangs and robbers. Meanwhile, to make matters worse, Thomas, with creditors still on his tail, abruptly abandoned Carey and started a lucrative medical practice in Calcutta. Meanwhile, undernourished and ill-housed, William, Dorothy, and their eldest son, Felix, battled dysentery. In fact, Felix very nearly died. Dorothy and her sister became restless. Carey wrote, quote, "My wife and her sister are constantly exclaiming against me. They think it very hard indeed that Thomas should live in a city in an affluent manner practicing medicine, while they are forced to go into a wilderness and live without many of what they call the necessities of life, bread in particular." Well, needing some startup funds, he asked Thomas for his share of the mission's savings, which were supposed to last for a year. Thomas informed him he'd spent it all setting up his surgical business. Carey was devastated. He wrote, "I'm in a strange land, alone, no Christian friend, a large family, and nothing to supply their wants. I blame Mr. T for leading me into such expense." And then he added rather remorsefully, "and I blame myself for being so led." Slowly, it seems, their dreams were fading. And yet, although feeling depressed, Carey continued to study Bengali and used some of his meagre resources to hire a pundit. A pundit would be a local native teacher. In a few weeks, he began preaching to small gatherings through an interpreter and even began some rudimentary Bible translation. Finally, with Dr. Thomas's help, he borrowed some money, and on February the 4th, a group comprising 2 women, an infant, 3 boys under 10, and with both Dorothy and Felix still seriously ill, they, all together with William Carey, began a 3-day journey along rivers and salt lakes, heading for an untamed region in India known as the Sundarbans jungle. Doesn't sound very attractive, does it? A later missionary described it like this: "The rivers swarm with hideous alligators, which we often see basking on the shores, or rather embedded in the mud of which the banks consist. Tigers of the fiercest kind pass and repass every night over ground where the people are at work in the day, and snakes of enormous size and deadly poison abound." Well, the party made it, but within a month, plans changed yet again. Carey was offered the job of a manager of an indigo plant in a place called Madnabati. Now, indigo is a blue dye, and it was used with cotton yarn and was hugely in demand. Carey realised that the income he would receive could support the mission, and he saw this as God's provision. But some supporters back home were less impressed. In fact, they were shocked when they received this news, and they wrote to him. Now, Carey hadn't received any letters for 17 months. That wasn't just because of the length of time of travel, but because of the war. And one of the first letters he did receive in India contained this complaint, quote, "The spirit of a missionary is swallowed up in the pursuits of a merchant." Carey wrote a sharp and somewhat convoluted wordy reply, which said, quote, "To vindicate my own spirit or conduct, I am very averse, it being a constant maxim with me that if my conduct will not vindicate itself, it is not worth vindicating." The correspondent from England clearly didn't understand. Just as today, some still don't see the value or understand what is known as business as mission. BAM, B-A-M. The benefits for Carey and for the work were many and significant. Firstly, as a manager of 100 Bengalis at the Indigo factory, he was in absolutely the right place to quickly learn the language and to be able to converse in it fluently and naturally. Secondly, his work as manager involved him in visiting many villages where he was also able to share the gospel. Thirdly, and we shouldn't underestimate this, he now had legal status in the country, which is what he needed. It gave him a safe position with little chance of being deported. And, as already mentioned, he had an income which would not only be sufficient for him and the family to live on, but could help progress the work of mission. Interestingly enough, there was a sympathetic East India Company official called Mr. Short, and he took pity on them and temporarily accommodated them in his own place. And then, yet again, the Careys moved. Now, this is now the 5th time in 7 months, and they moved to a place called Malda, which is about 300 miles, or what's that, 500 kilometers to the north of Calcutta. Carey would write, "For a long time, my mouth has been shut and my days have been clouded with heaviness. Now I begin to see and feel something like a traveller who has almost been beaten out in a violent storm, and who, with all his clothes about him dripping wet, sees the sky begin to clear." Unfortunately, the skies were not about to clear. In fact, they were about to get a whole lot darker. Almost immediately after moving, William Carey contracted malaria. Now, you've got to remember, this was long before there was any effective anti-malarial drugs. And as a result of this, he was doubled up with convulsions for 26 hours before finally recovering. In that condition, it's really quite incredible that at that time he survived. He could have very easily died. Meanwhile, Dorothy was struck yet again with dysentery. And to bring her further grief, her sister and confidant Kitty had been asked by Mr. Short of the East India Company to marry him. And having accepted his proposal, she left the group to become his wife. Dorothy's physical and mental health continued to decline. But it was the death of her favourite blue-eyed 5-year-old boy, Peter, that finally did it. No one would carry his coffin, as to do so would mean an Indian was breaking caste. So William had to dig the grave, carry the coffin alone, and bury his own son. For Dorothy, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. She never recovered from the blow, and her mental state declined in an accelerating way. And it was probably during the first 3 months of 1795 that she slipped across the border between sanity and insanity, and was soon described by both the local co-workers and also some Europeans as being wholly deranged. Began having illusions, including accusing William Carey of adultery and even threatening him, her husband, with a knife. Carey was overwhelmed by it all. But the first acknowledgement of a problem comes from a letter he wrote to his sisters in England on October the 5th, 1775. He wrote, quote, "I have a greater affliction than any of those in my family. Known to my friends here, but I've never mentioned it to anyone in England before, is my poor wife, who is looked upon as insane. I have been for some time in danger of losing my life, and jealousy is the great evil that haunts her mind." He later wrote, "This is indeed the valley of the shadow of death to me. Oh, what I would give for a kind, sympathetic friend, such as I had in England, to whom I might open my heart." Much has been written regarding the mental illness that clearly afflicted Dorothy. William Carey and John Thomas both wondered initially if she might be demon-possessed. But after reading a psychiatric textbook, they concluded she suffered from mental illness. A psychiatrist recently wrote that today we would diagnose Dorothy's condition as a delusional disorder, formerly called paranoia, of the jealous type. The prognosis, the outlook for intense delusional conditions, is probably as poor today as it proved to be for Dorothy over 200 years ago. She never improved, and life began to take on a frantic tone. Thomas wrote, quote, "She's uttered the most blasphemous and bitter imprecations against him when Mrs. Thomas and I myself were present. She seized him by the hair of his head, and one time at the breakfast table held up a knife and said, 'Curse you, I could cut your throat.' And she has even made some attempts on his life." I think to say that the life for all the Careys was difficult would be an understatement. And the best strategy that he and Thomas could design was to confine her in a locked room. During the next 12 years, Dorothy would enjoy only some very brief times of liberty. And there is little doubt that her weakened physical health contributed to her mental deterioration. I mean, added to the fact was the fact that she buried 2 daughters in England, buried her son in India, she'd lost the companionship of her sister, and by temperament seemed to have been a fearful person. and had probably completely lost trust in her husband William's ability to care for her. So the combination of those things doubtless goes some way to explaining the reason for her condition. Meanwhile, in the midst of the chaos and heartbreak, Carey continued onwards with the work. During the long, hot summer days of 1794, he'd spend an exhausting period managing 100 men in the Indigo factory. And then at night, he would concentrate on translating parts of the Bible into Bengali. In less than 2 years, he could preach 30 minutes in Bengali. And after 4 years, the New Testament was ready for printing. He also learned Sanskrit, managed to set up 2 schools, and yet in 1995, although he didn't have a single convert to speak of, he established a Baptist church in Malda, which comprised just 4 English people. After 7 years' toil in Bengal, he still couldn't point to a single individual who professed faith in Christ. And another setback came when John Thomas deserted him again, this time to engage in the rum business so that he could stay ahead of his creditors. William Carey wrote, "Mr. Thomas has gone far away, and my domestic troubles are sometimes too heavy for me. I am distressed, yet supported, and I trust not totally dead in the things of God." His domestic troubles, as he called them, included, perhaps not surprisingly, his 4 boys. In 1796, despite her insanity and threats to William, Dorothy had perhaps surprisingly borne another son, Jonathan. With Dorothy mentally unstable and William consumed with his work, the boys became neglected and had become very unruly. William failed to be the father they needed, partly because he was too mild and failed to discipline them, and partly because of the huge demands of the work of the ministry. Carey would later write, "When I left England, my hope of India's conversion was very strong, but amongst so many obstacles, it would die unless upheld by God. Nothing to exercise it, but plenty to obstruct it for the past 1 year and 19 days. Well, I have God, and his word is true. And though the superstitions of the heathen were 1,000 times stronger than they are, and the example of the Europeans 1,000 times worse, though I were deserted by all and persecuted by all, yet my faith, fixed on his sure word, will rise above all obstructions and overcome every trial. God's cause will triumph." Amazing. One of William Carey's best known quotations is this: "I can plod, I can persevere in any definite pursuit. To this, I owe everything." And he exemplifies the plodding spirit, the great challenge to keeping on, to persevering, even when everything else around seems to be falling apart. In his original booklet called The Inquiry, it was divided, as I said, into 5 sections. The last section laid out the duties of the church and of Christians to mobilize missionaries. And the first and continuing duty had to be prayer. Carey saw that the most important means to achieve world evangelization had to be united prayer. He wrote, "The most glorious works of grace that ever took place have been in answer to prayer. And it is in this way we have the greatest reason to suppose that the glorious outpouring of the Spirit, which we expect at last, will be bestowed." Of course, we have the pattern already of the Moravians, that whole movement born in prayer. And now we have what is today, as I said, the BMS, World Mission. We have the example of Operation Mobilization, born in nights of prayer. That, he saw, was the greatest key to the way forwards. And as he and others prayed, finally, the dark clouds that had looked so dark for so long were about to part and shed some very welcome light in their midst. And if you want to know what that is, then you'll have to join us again this time next week. Thank you, Malu. If you just unmute everybody, or you would all unmute yourselves, I should say. God bless you. Nice to see you. Quotation, a message from our Indian brother there. God bless you. Come next week and hear the third part of the life and legacy. God bless you. Pleasure. God bless all of you. Jonah, nice to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jonah.
Thank you so much, Gareth, giving great information.
That's a pleasure, brother. Nice to see you, Kevin. Caroline,
I'm really enjoying your information. Please continue praying for you.
Thank you so much. Yes, it'd be good to see you next week. Joe and Beth, good to see you too. Hope you get strengthened in the coming days. Jolie.